The police station in Harlan County, Kentucky looks the same at 2 in the morning as it does at 2 in the afternoon. Fluorescent lights that hum at a frequency just below what your ears can process. Linoleum floors the color of old mustard. A wall clock with a second hand that sticks, then lurches forward like it keeps changing its mind about moving at all. Ray Colton had been sitting in that plastic chair for 40 minutes. He wasn't handcuffed. He wasn't under arrest. He was there because Special Agent Hartwell had asked him to come in, and Ray Colton was the kind of man who, when a federal agent asked him to come in at 2 in the morning, showed up. Not out of fear, out of something closer to respect for the process, even when the process had, in his experience, failed more times than it had succeeded. He sat with his hands on his thighs, not clasped, not fidgeting, just resting there the way a man's hands rest when he has spent decades learning that movement doesn't always help. The vest was still on. Iron Ridge MC, the lettering on the back had faded from sharp white to something closer to bone, which felt appropriate. 22 years of road dust and rain, and the particular kind of wear that comes not from neglect, but from use. From actually living inside the thing rather than just wearing it. His beard was the gray of a sky that can't decide whether to rain or clear. His face was the kind that people described as hard until they looked at his eyes, and then they usually stopped using that word. He was 68 years old, and he looked like he had seen everything worth seeing and was still deciding whether any of it had been worth it. The door opened. A woman in her early 40s walked in carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. She set one in front of Ray without asking whether he wanted it. He appreciated that. He picked it up. Her name was Special Agent Donna Hartwell, and she moved like someone who had learned very early that a room full of men would only take her seriously if she walked into it like she already owned it. She sat down across from Ray, opened a folder, and slid a single printed page across the table. Ray looked at it. A screenshot. Browser history from a laptop. A search query in plain black text. How long does hypothermia take in an unheated room? He looked at it for a long time. Long enough that the clock on the wall ticked through its hesitation twice. Then Hartwell leaned forward just slightly. "Mr. Colton," she said, "how did you know?" Ray set the paper cup down. He didn't look at her. He looked at that search query, at those 12 words sitting there on a white background, like they were nothing, like someone had typed them casually, like it was the kind of thing a person just wondered about. He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to be uncomfortable. Then he said, "She asked to sit down." Hartwell waited. Ray didn't add anything. She wrote something in her notepad. Then she looked up. "Walk me through it. From the beginning." Ray picked up the coffee again. Outside the window, Highway 421 was dark and empty, the way it always was at this hour. He had driven that road more times than he could count. He knew every curve of it, every gas station, every overpass, every stretch of guardrail where somebody had gotten it wrong and the metal still hadn't been fixed. He thought about where to start. 3 weeks ago, he said, the Heron Diner, Tuesday morning. The Heron Diner sat on the southbound side of Highway 421 at the edge of town, which meant it caught the early crowd heading toward Middlesboro and the late crowd heading back. It had been there since 1987. The sign out front had lost the H in Heron sometime around 2019, and the owner had never gotten around to replacing it, so locals just called it the Aaron, which was not a word in any language, but had started to feel like one. Ray Colton had been coming in every Tuesday for 11 years. Same table, corner booth back, left facing the door. The kind of seat that a certain type of man gravitates toward without being able to explain exactly why, except that it lets you see the room and keeps the wall at your back, and some habits survive the wars that created them by decades. He arrived at 11:30. He ordered black coffee, no sugar, and sometimes a piece of pie if Joni had made her lemon meringue the day before. Usually he didn't eat much. He stayed until around 1. He read nothing, scrolled nothing, watched nothing. He just sat. People who didn't know him thought he was waiting for someone. People who knew him understood that this was simply what Tuesday looked like for Ray Colton, and they had learned not to question it, the same way they had learned not to question why a man who had driven motorcycles for 40 years still checked his mirrors in his car. It was a ritual, and rituals for a certain kind of man are not habits, they are maintenance. Joni Pruitt had been working the Tuesday shift at the Heron for 9 years. She was 52 with hair that had started blonde and was negotiating the transition to something more silver without any particular urgency. She refilled Ray's coffee without being asked and did not make conversation unless he started it first, which was not often. This was the quality he appreciated most in another person, the ability to be present without requiring acknowledgement. On this particular Tuesday, she refilled his cup at 11:42 and then paused beside the table for just a moment. Quiet today, she said. He said. She moved on. 12 minutes later, the door opened. Ray noticed her before she was fully inside. That was not unusual. He noticed most people who came through that door. 22 years of riding with the club and 2 deployments had calibrated something in him that most people had never needed to develop a kind of peripheral awareness that operated below conscious thought that registered anomalies the way a ship registers a shifting current. Not alarm, just attention. What he noticed first was the way she moved. She was in her early 70s. A small woman who had probably been a few inches taller before the years had made their usual argument with her spine. She wore a winter coat, dark navy wool, the kind with toggle buttons buttoned all the way to the collar. It was April. The temperature outside was 61 degrees. She walked with a limp that favored her left side. Not the limp of a recent injury. The limp of someone who had learned to compensate, who had mapped their own body's geography over a long time and adjusted their route accordingly. Careful, deliberate. Like every stump was a small calculation. Her hair was white and clean and cut shorter than she probably would have chosen for herself. Not badly cut, just practically cut. The way hair gets cut when someone else is making the decisions. Her eyes moved before the rest of her did. She was inside the door for 3 full seconds before she took another step. And in those 3 seconds, her eyes went around the room in a pattern that Ray recognized because he used it himself. Not taking in the scenery, assessing, counting exits, placing people. Then she started moving. The couple by the window retired, Ray guessed, based on the unhurried way they were eating and the fact that it was a Tuesday, and they didn't look like people with anywhere to be glanced up when she approached. The woman said something with an apologetic smile. The man looked back at his plate. The chair stayed where it was. The construction crew near the jukebox didn't even look up. One of them mumbled something. She moved on. The young mother in the corner booth with 2 kids under 5 in the seats beside her met the old woman's eyes for exactly 1 second and then looked at the kids and said something quick and quiet. The old woman nodded, turned. She was about to leave. That was the part that Ray would think about later. She wasn't angry. She wasn't embarrassed. She nodded the way you nod when something has happened exactly as you expected it to, and she turned, and for just a moment her face showed nothing at all, which was somehow worse than if it had shown disappointment. Then her eyes found his table. She walked over. She stood at the edge of his booth and looked at him, not with the hesitation he might have expected from a woman her age standing in front of someone who looked like him, but with the particular steadiness of a person who has already decided something and is simply waiting for the outcome. "Is anyone sitting here?" she said. Ray looked at the empty booth across from him. He didn't smile. He didn't make any expression at all. He reached over and pulled the chair out. "Sit," he said. She sat. She settled into the booth the way people settle in when they are not used to sitting freely anymore. Carefully, checking the space around her. Her hands came to rest on the table and then moved to her lap and then came back to the table, and he let her take that time without filling it. She ordered from Joni without looking at the menu. Coffee and toast. That was it. When it came, she looked at the toast for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she picked up a piece and took a small bite and chewed it with a focus that was almost methodical, like she was reminding herself how this worked. Ray watched. Not obviously, the way you watch something when you don't want it to know it's being watched. The coat stayed on. That was the first thing he cataloged. 61 degrees outside. The diner ran warm. Every other person in the room had either removed their jacket or loosened it. Hers stayed buttoned to the collar. The second thing was her wrist. Her left hand was wrapped around the coffee cup, and when she lifted it, the sleeve of the coat shifted just enough. A bruise faded to yellow at the edges, but still carrying a darker center. The shape was not the shape of a fall. A fall gives you a bruise that has no particular logic to its outline. This one had a shape, an impression almost, the kind that comes from a grip, from something wrapping around and holding. He had seen that shape before. On his brother Tommy's arm the last time he had visited, when Tommy had said everything was fine, just fine, which in retrospect had been the most expensive 2 words Ray had ever believed. He looked away from the wrist. Her shoes, he noticed, were worn unevenly. The left heel carried more weight than the right, which made sense given the limp, but the degree of wear suggested she had been walking on hard surfaces for extended periods. Not strolling, walking. The kind of walking you do when you're moving around an interior that offers no rest. Every few minutes she looked toward the window that faced the parking lot. Not because she was admiring the view. He watched the calculation in it. the measuring. The way her eyes would go there and then come back, and something in her posture would either settle fractionally or tighten depending on what she saw or didn't see outside. She was counting time. He recognized that too. They sat in silence for a while, and Ray let the silence be what it was. He had never been a man who felt compelled to fill quiet space. Quiet was not emptiness. It was where information lived if you were patient enough to let it surface. She spoke first. "How long has this place been here?" she asked, not looking at him, looking at the window. "Since '87, he said, give or take." "It looks like it," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that was not critical, more like the recognition of something that had survived, which was itself a thing worth noting. A pause. "Used to have a place like this near where I lived," she said, "over on Harness Road. Closed in 2011 when the new highway bypass took the traffic away." Another pause. "Things don't always survive being bypassed." He didn't respond to that. He didn't think she was asking him to. They sat a little longer. Then in a voice that was lower and deliberate, the way a person's voice gets when they are testing a surface before they put their full weight on it, she said, "I'm not supposed to be outside." Ray set his coffee cup down. He did it carefully. He looked at the table between them, not at her. "Says who?" he said. She looked at her coffee. "My nephew. He says it's not safe, that I might get confused, wander off." A beat. "Do you get confused?" he asked. She looked at him. It was the first time she had looked at him directly, not the careful sideways assessment she had been doing since she sat down, but a direct, steady look. And what was in that look was not what he expected. It was not fear. It was not fragility. It was clarity. A specific, focused kind of clarity that you see in people who have had to be very precise about what they know and do not know because imprecision has become dangerous. "No," she said, one word. Flat. Certain. He believed her completely. He asked how she had gotten there. She said there was a woman, Beth she called her, a postal carrier, who stopped at the house to leave packages, who had given her a ride. Beth thought she was a visitor from out of town just spending a few days. She didn't ask questions. People generally didn't ask questions when you gave them a simple enough story to work with. Marcus, her nephew, had a meeting that morning, left at 8:15. He was usually back by 2. She had arrived at the diner at 11:47. She knew the window. She had calculated it. 2 hours before what? Ray asked. She looked toward the parking lot window again. "Before he notices I'm gone," she said. Ray said nothing. He understood the geometry of that sentence, what fit inside it, what it implied about the space she lived in. What kind of life generated that kind of precision about a 2-hour window? Her name was Dorothy Caldwell, she told him. She had taught second grade at Harlan Elementary for 32 years. She had been married to a man named William for 41 years. William died of a heart attack 11 years ago in the kitchen, which she had always thought was unfair because he never cooked. Their daughter Louise had died of ovarian cancer at 36. After Louise, Dorothy had lived alone. She had managed fine. She had more than managed. She had kept the house, kept her garden, kept her friendships, attended St. Augustine's on Sundays, and organized the holiday book drive at the county library for 7 consecutive years. She said this not as a defense, but as context, as the record she wanted on the table. Then Marcus Webb had come back to town, her late sister's boy. She hadn't seen him in years. He showed up well-dressed and solicitous, full of concern about whether she should really be managing on her own, whether the house was too much, whether the stairs were safe, whether she might fall, and no one would find her for days. He painted a picture of danger that was specifically calibrated to the fears a woman in her early 70s might reasonably have, and he painted it very, very well. She had seen through it, she said. Not at first, but soon enough. By then it was too late to say so. He had moved her into his house in stages that each had reasonable explanations. The driving first too dangerous, he said, and he wasn't entirely wrong. Her reaction time had slowed, so she let that one go. The phone next the bill was too high. He said he'd get her a better plan, and then the better plan never materialized, and the phone was gone. The visits from her quilting circle, he was worried about germs about the neighborhood, about her getting overstimulated, and each explanation had just enough surface logic to her friends that they nodded and stopped coming, because people stop coming when the excuses are just plausible enough. The room she lived in was a converted garage, a bed, a chair, a space heater, a window that didn't open, a lock on the door on the outside. She said that last part without particular emphasis, just as information. Ray was very still. The food, she said, got smaller. Not all at once, gradually. The way you'd lower the temperature of a room 1 degree at a time so that the person inside it would keep adjusting instead of noticing. She looked at her coffee cup. He's not a monster, she said quietly. I want you to understand that he's something I find almost harder to explain. He's a man who started telling himself a story about what he was doing, and the story got easier to believe the longer he told it. He needed money. He was frightened. And I was available. Ray looked at her. She met his eyes again. I am telling you this because I need you to understand that the danger is very real, and I need you to understand that I am very clear about what's happening, and I need you to understand that I have been doing something about it for 2 years, as much as I was able. What have you been doing? And he said. She opened her purse. She reached in and took out a key, small metal with a tag attached. She set it on the table between them. Unit 47, Pine Ridge Self-Storage. Harlan. The tag was worn at the edges. The writing on it was faded but legible. Ray looked at it without touching it. There's a storage unit, she said. I rented it 2 years ago when I still had access to my own money, before he redirected the accounts. She looked at the key. I've been putting things there. Documents, records, notes. Everything I could get my hands on before the access was gone. What kind of documents, he said. The kind that explain what he's doing and why. She paused. Insurance policies, property records, doctor's reports I was never asked to authorize. She paused again. 47 pages of notes in my handwriting. Dates, conversations, what I ate, what the temperature was, what the lock sounded like. He looked at her. You were building a case, he said. I am a woman who taught children to read for 32 years. She said, I know how evidence works. I know that feelings are not enough. I know that a 72-year-old woman who says her nephew is trying to hurt her will be nodded at very sympathetically and sent home with a pamphlet about community resources. She picked up her coffee. So I made sure there was something more than feelings. He was quiet for a moment. Why me? He said. She looked at him, and something shifted in her expression. Not the sharpness. The sharpness was always there. Something softer, something she had probably been managing carefully for a long time, came just briefly to the surface. I'll tell you, she said, but first I need to know something. Ask, he said. If I tell you what I know and give you what I have, she said carefully, what do you do with it? It was a fair question. Ray understood why she was asking it. She had calculated the 2-hour window she had ridden here with a mail carrier who thought she was from out of town. She had sat down at his table instead of every other table in this room. She had planned this. Whatever she told him next was not going to be an accident. Ray Colton thought about his brother Tommy, who had died in a room by himself in Lexington in 2004, while Ray was 6,000 miles away and couldn't get back in time. He thought about the phone call. He thought about the nurse's voice saying he went quietly, as though that were a comfort, as though quietly were the important part, as though the going was not the thing that mattered. He thought about the years since then, the particular way grief calcifies if you let it, the way it can either hollow you out or harden you into something functional if you're willing to do the work. He thought about what he had turned it into. I listen, he said, and then I take it to the people I trust. He held her gaze, and we handle it correctly. She studied him for a moment. Reading him, he thought, the way good teachers read students past what they present and into what they are. Then she nodded. She talked for the better part of 20 minutes. He did not interrupt. He did not take notes. He remembered what he needed to remember, which was everything. He asked 3 questions during that time. Specific factual questions about timeline and access in the structure of what Marcus had built. She answered all 3 without hesitation and with precision. When she was done, she looked at her watch. It was an analog watch, old, with a cracked face. She looked at it the way you look at something when the time it shows is information you need but don't want. I should go, she said. She started to gather herself, button the coat that had never been unbuttoned, check the parking lot window one more time. The key, Ray said. She looked at the table. The key was still there. She picked up her purse. Her movements were unhurried, deliberate. She placed a $10 bill on the table, more than the cost of the coffee and toast, and pushed herself up from the booth. Keep it, she said. She meant the key. He looked at it. Ms. Caldwell, he said. She was already at the edge of the booth. She stopped, turned back slightly, not all the way, just enough. He wanted to say several things. He was not by nature a man of several things. I'll be at this table next Tuesday, he said. She looked at him for a moment. I know, she said. And then she walked toward the door, and the limp was there with every step, and the coat stayed buttoned, and she didn't look back. Ray sat there after she was gone. He picked up the key. He turned it over in his hand. Felt the weight of it, which was almost nothing, which was also the point. You could carry it for a long time and barely know it was there, and that was exactly what she needed it to be. Something that could be kept. Something portable. Something a woman could hold on to for 2 years in a converted garage with a lock on the outside of the door. Joni appeared at the edge of the table. She picked up Dorothy's empty coffee cup. She picked up the $10 bill. She looked at it for a moment, then set it back down on the table. "She's been in here before," Joni said, not looking at him. "A few times, always on days when Marcus is busy, always watching the door." Ray looked at her. Joni still wasn't looking at him. She was wiping the table, moving the cloth in careful circles. "I've seen him. Marcus. Comes in sometimes. Saturdays mostly sits at the counter. Everybody talks to him. He's the kind of man everybody talks to." A pause. "He always asks if she's been in. Said she tends to wander." Ray said nothing. "I always said no," Joni said. She looked up at him then, and her expression was the expression of someone who has been carrying a specific weight for a specific amount of time and is not sure yet whether they're about to set it down. Figured it was her business whether he knew she'd been in or not. She picked up the cloth. "She ever say anything to you?" Ray said. Joni was quiet for a moment, looked toward the door. "Once," she said, "few months back. She was at the counter and she slid me a 5 for a 2.50 coffee, and she leaned over and she said very quiet, very calm, the way you'd say something to make sure the words stayed with the person you said them to." Joni stopped. She pressed her lips together briefly. She said, "If I don't come back, it's not because I didn't want to." The clock on the wall ticked and lurched. "And then she left," Joni said. "And I told myself I was reading too much into it." She looked at Ray directly. "I've been telling myself that for 6 months." Ray stood up. He put the $10 bill from the table into his vest pocket. Then he reached into his own pocket, took out a 20 and set it on the table. "Joni," he said. She looked at him. "Don't tell anybody she was here today," he said. She nodded once. The kind of nod that means I already understood that I was just waiting for you to say it. Ray walked toward the door. He stepped outside into the April air and stood in the parking lot for a moment. His bike was parked to the left end of the row the way he always parked it. The highway hummed in the distance. He looked down at the key in his hand. Unit 47, Pine Ridge Self-Storage. He thought about what she had said. "I've been putting things there for 2 years. The patience in that. The long game thinking of it. Not a woman who was confused. Not a woman who was wandering. A woman who had identified a threat, understood that she could not address it directly, and systematically constructed a countermeasure over 24 months with whatever access and resources she could still reach." He thought about the way she had looked at him when he asked if she got confused. No, one word. No qualifier, no bitterness, just the clean, flat fact of it. He thought about the coat buttoned all the way in 61 degrees. He thought about the wrist. He thought about the food getting smaller, 1 degree at a time. He thought about Tommy. He took out his phone. It was a flip phone, the kind that people made comments about, which he did not particularly care about. He had 2 contacts that he actually used. He scrolled to one of them. Slade. It rang twice. "Yeah," said a voice on the other end. Flat, awake. Slade Harmon had been awake when Ray called him at every hour of the day or night for 15 years. Ray had stopped thinking about this and started thinking of it as a feature. "I need to talk," Ray said. "Where are you, T. Heron? Parking lot." 20 minutes, Slade said, and the line went dead. Ray stood in the parking lot and waited, and the highway hummed, and somewhere inside the diner Joni was pouring coffee for the lunch crowd that was starting to drift in, and the key was in his hand, and he turned it over once, twice, 3 times. He had come in for coffee. He was not going home the same person who had arrived. That was the thing about paying attention he had learned. Once you started doing it, once you committed to the practice of actually looking at the world instead of through it, you gave up a certain kind of comfort. The comfort of being uninvolved, of moving through spaces without taking on the weight of what lived inside them. His brother Tommy had lived inside a space for the last year of his life. A room in a facility in Lexington with a call button that went unanswered, and staff who were spread too thin to be blamed individually, and a system that had agreed on paper that Tommy was cared for. Tommy had been 47 years old. He had laughed like he was trying to bring down the ceiling. He had known the statistics for every Kentucky Wildcats game since 1978. He had been afraid of the dark in a way he never told anyone, which Ray only discovered after the fact from a night shift nurse who said she used to leave the hallway light on because she had noticed. 47 years old, and no one had noticed in time. Ray was not going to be the person who didn't notice. He had made that decision, and he had kept it, and he intended to keep it until there was nothing left of him to keep promises with. He stood in the parking lot until he heard the sound of a bike on 421 heading toward him. Then he closed his hand around the key and waited. There are things you learn about a place by sitting in its diner every Tuesday for 11 years. You learn the rhythms of it. The way the morning crowd is different from the afternoon crowd, the way the energy shifts around noon when the working people come in hungry, and direct the way it shifts again around 3, when the retired couples arrive, and slow everything down into something more like a conversation than a transaction. You learn who leaves good tips and who doesn't, and you learn that these are not the same people you would have predicted. You learn the sound of the kitchen on a bad day versus a good one. And if you are paying the kind of attention that Ray Colton paid, not because he was suspicious of the world, but because he had learned in the hardest possible way that the cost of not paying attention was levied on people who hadn't chosen to pay it, you learned something else. You learned which people came in with their eye au door and their sleeves pulled down, who ordered less than they were hungry for, who checked their watch with the careful frequency of someone measuring their remaining freedom in minutes. He had noticed Dorothy Caldwell the first time she came in. He had not known her name then. He had not known anything about her. He had just noticed the coat in the window and the precise guarded quality of how she moved through the space, and he had filed it away the way he filed away everything, not obsessively, not with alarm, just cleanly and completely, into the part of his mind where things lived until they became relevant. He had not expected her to sit down. He had not expected what she said after she sat down. He had not expected the key. What he had not known, what he would not know until much later, when a federal agent would explain it to him in a room with fluorescent lights and a clock that couldn't make up its mind, was the part about the courthouse. 6 months before she walked into the Heron Diner and asked if she could sit down, Dorothy Caldwell had been in the back seat of Beth Carver's postal truck on a different errand, on a different manufactured 2-hour window. They had driven past the Harlan County Courthouse on a Wednesday afternoon, and Dorothy had seen from the backseat window a scene on the sidewalk. A young man homeless, she thought based on the state of his jacket and the size of the bag beside him, was being pushed around by a group of 3 who thought this was entertainment. Not violence exactly, the particular low-cost cruelty of people who have decided someone doesn't count. And then a man had walked over from the parking lot. He was large and wore a leather vest and had a beard that was going gray, and he moved with the deliberate unhaste of someone who had nowhere urgent to be and was choosing specifically to be here. He didn't say anything. He didn't touch anyone. He walked over and he stood next to the young man, and he looked at the 3 who thought this was entertainment, and he just stood there. They left within 30 seconds. The man watched them go. Then he looked at the young man, said something brief, and walked back to the parking lot and rode away on a motorcycle. Dorothy Caldwell had watched all of this from the backseat window of the postal truck, and she had thought that is someone who knows how to stand still. She had asked Beth who he was. Beth had said she thought he was one of the Iron Ridge guys usually parked at the Heron on Tuesdays. Dorothy had said nothing else. She had gone home, back to the garage, back to the 2 small portions and the lock on the outside of the door, and the space heater that worked when it felt like it, and the window that didn't open. And she had started planning 6 months. She had spent 6 months waiting for the right Tuesday, the right window, the right set of variables to align. Because she was not a woman who acted without preparation. She was a woman who had taught children for 32 years that the answer you guessed at was worth less than the answer you worked for. She had worked for this one. And when she walked into the Heron Diner on that Tuesday in April, and Ray Colton pulled out the chair and said, "Sit," she was not walking toward a stranger. She was completing a plan. Slade Harmon pulled into the parking lot at 20 minutes past 1. He killed the engine and swung off the bike in one motion that had the economy of something done 10,000 times. He was 58, with gray hair pulled back and a face that had the topography of someone who had made decisions that mattered for a very long time. He wasn't a big man in the way that announced itself. He was a big man in the way that a room notices without being able to say exactly why. He walked up to Ray and stood next to him and looked at the highway. Ray told him all of it. He didn't editorialize. He didn't speculate. He presented the facts in order and let Slade receive them the way Slade received everything, which was without interruption and without visible reaction until he had the full picture. When Ray was done, Slade was quiet for a moment. He looked at the key in Ray's hand. "You believe him," he said. "Yeah," Ray said. Slade nodded, looked back at the highway. Then we move, he said. 2 words. Ray closed the key in his fist. Above them, the April sky was the particular blue of something that had no intention of apologizing for itself, wide and clear, and going all the way to the edges of things. The highway hummed. And the second hand on the clock, inside the Heron Diner, lurched forward, and the lunch crowds settled into their booths, and Joni Pruitt refilled coffees and carried plates, and did not once mention to anyone that there had been a woman in a navy wool coat sitting at the back corner table that morning, or that a key had changed hands, or that something had shifted in the particular way that things shift when a person who has been paying attention finally has something to show for it. Ray Colton walked to his bike. He had a storage unit to find. Pine Ridge Self-Storage sat 3 miles south of downtown Harlan, on a stretch of road that had once been a hardware supply corridor and was now a collection of pawn shops, a tire center, and a laundromat with a hand-painted sign that said "Clean Clothes, Clean Conscience," which Ray had always thought was either very profound or very good advertising, and probably both. The storage facility itself was unremarkable in the way that places built entirely for function are unremarkable. Chain link perimeter, gravel lot, 2 rows of orange roll-up doors running parallel to each other like something that had stopped halfway through, becoming something else. A small office at the entrance with a window unit air conditioner that rattled even when it wasn't hot enough to need one. Ray pulled in at 2:17 in the afternoon. Slade pulled in 10 seconds behind him. They walked to Unit 47 without conversation. The key fit the padlock cleanly, no resistance, which told Ray that Dorothy had been here recently enough to keep it from seizing. He pulled the lock free and lifted the door, and the smell that came out was dry paper and a faint trace of cedar from a block someone had placed in the corner to keep the moisture down. The unit was 10 by 10, almost entirely empty, one cardboard box centered on the concrete floor, medium-sized, sealed with packing tape that had been applied in straight, even strips. The handwriting on the top said only Unit 47. No name, no address, just those 2 words in the careful print of someone who had spent decades writing on chalkboards for children to read. Slade crouched down and used his pocket knife to slice the tape. Ray stood at the threshold and let the afternoon light come over his shoulder and into the space, and he watched Slade open the flaps and begin to lay the contents out on the floor with the methodical care of someone who understood that the order things came out in might matter. Insurance policy. Standard form is several pages, the kind that life insurance companies print on paper, slightly heavier than everything else, so it feels like something permanent. The name on the policy was Dorothy Jean Caldwell. The beneficiary line had been updated. There was a date stamp on the update 14 months ago, and the name in that line was Marcus Allen Webb. Slade set it to the left. Property deed. Dorothy's house on Clover Mill Road, Harlan County. The original deed was there with William Caldwell's name alongside Dorothy's. Below it, a second document, a transfer of title notarized dated 11 months ago, bearing Dorothy's signature in a hand that was shakier than the writing on the box and the name of the notary public and the new sole owner, Marcus Allen Webb. Ray looked at the signature. He thought about what Dorothy had said. The food getting smaller 1 degree at a time. The way you'd lower the temperature of a room so the person inside kept adjusting instead of noticing. He thought about what a signature looks like when it's produced by a 72-year-old woman who hasn't been eating enough for months and hasn't slept well in longer, and has been told daily by the person controlling her access to everything that she is confused and unreliable and needs to be managed. He didn't say anything about the signature. Slade set the deed to the left. Then he lifted out the notebook. It was a composition notebook, the classic black and white marbled cover, the kind that costs $1.50 at any drugstore, and has been used by American students for roughly a century. This one was full. Every page, for front and back, written in a hand that started on the first page with a steadiness that was almost architectural, and became by the final pages a little more effortful, but no less precise. Slade opened the front cover and read the first page, and then he handed it to Ray without a word. The first page said, "My name is Dorothy Jean Caldwell. I am 72 years old. I am a retired school teacher. I am not confused. I am not prone to wandering. I do not require supervision. I am writing this because I understand that if something happens to me, there will be an explanation already prepared by the person who caused it, and that explanation will be believed, and this notebook is the counter-argument. The date I am writing this is March 14th. I will write the year at the end of this notebook when I am done because I don't know how long this will take." Ray read it once. Then he read it again. Then he turned the page and started reading the rest, standing in the doorway of a 10 by 10 storage unit with April light coming over his shoulder, and he did not stop until he had read all 47 pages. It took him 22 minutes. Slade sat on the gravel outside and looked at the sky and did not rush him. When Ray was done, he closed the notebook and stood there for a moment with it in his hands. 47 pages of dates and temperatures and meal size and overheard phone calls and the exact words Marcus had used on specific days when he wanted Dorothy to believe something about herself that wasn't true. The name of the notary. The name of the insurance company. The name of the physician who had apparently generated a report on Dorothy's cognitive state that Dorothy had never been asked to participate in. The date the lock was installed on the outside of her door. The date the window was sealed. The date she had last seen her friends from the quilting circle. The date she had last spoken to another human being who was not Marcus or occasionally Beth Carver. Every day cataloged, every small reduction noted, not with emotion, with precision. The way a scientist records data, because the scientist understands that feelings are not the record, facts are the record, and the record is what survives. Ray stepped out of the unit and set the notebook on top of the other documents Slade had laid on the gravel. "She's been building this for 2 years, Ray said. "I can see that," Slade said. "He has the house, he has the insurance, he has a medical report that probably says she's incompetent." "Yeah, and she's been in that garage documenting it piece by piece with whatever she could reach." Slade looked at him. "You already knew all that." "I know, I'm just—" Ray stopped. He looked at the notebook. She knew no one would believe her without proof, so she made proof, over 2 years, in a room with a lock on the outside. He was quiet for a moment. "That's not confusion. That's one of the clearest things I've ever seen anyone do." Slade looked at the documents on the gravel. "What do you want to do?" Ray thought about it. The standard answer was the police. Call it in hand over the storage unit, contents let the process work. He had spent enough years watching the process work to know that it could sometimes, under the right conditions, do exactly what it was supposed to do. He had also spent enough years watching it fail in the particular way it failed when the person being reported was clean and well-regarded and presented himself well and had an explanation for everything, and the person making the report was old and isolated and had, per a signed medical document, compromised cognition. "Not yet," Ray said. "Not with what we have." Slade nodded. He had already arrived at the same conclusion. Ray could see it in the way he'd been sitting out here instead of driving to the station himself. Ray picked up the notebook. "I want Decker to look at this first," he said. Slade was already reaching for his phone. Decker Moss arrived 40 minutes later. He drove a truck, not a bike. He had ridden bikes for most of his adult life and still kept one in his garage. But his knees had developed opinions over the past 5 years that conflicted with long distances on 2 wheels. And he had made his peace with this in the way that a practical man makes peace with anything, by finding the most efficient alternative and not wasting sentiment on what was gone. He was 55 with close-cut gray hair and the build of someone who had once been substantial and had thinned out gradually without losing the impression of substance. He had a way of standing that came from 15 years of walking into rooms where something had gone wrong and being the person who was supposed to make it right. Feet slightly apart. Weight even. Ready but not aggressive. The posture of someone who had learned to appear calm in order to make other people calm, and then had done it long enough that it stopped being an act. He got out of the truck and looked at the documents on the gravel and looked at Ray and didn't say anything for the first few seconds. Then he looked at the insurance policy. He picked it up, read the beneficiary line, set it down. He picked up the property deed, read the transfer of title, the date, the notary's name, set it down. He picked up the notebook and read the first 3 pages, set it down. Then he looked at Ray with an expression that Ray had not seen on Decker's face before, which was notable because Ray had seen Decker in a variety of circumstances that required expressions, and Decker generally produced them economically and without surplus. What was on his face now was something specific and dark and old, the look of a man seeing a thing he has seen before. "What?" Ray said. Decker crouched down and picked up the notebook again, turned to a page near the middle, read a paragraph. His jaw was tight. "The name," he said. "Marcus Webb. You know him." Decker looked up. "Not directly, but I know the pattern." He stood. 4 years ago," he said. "I was still at the county social services office. We got a referral. A neighbor called in, said she hadn't seen the woman next door in a while, said there was a man coming and going who didn't seem right." He turned the notebook over in his hands. "Woman's name was Ruth Hensley, 78 years old, retired librarian, lived alone since her husband passed. No children." He looked at the insurance policy on the gravel. "She died 11 months after the referral. Cardiac event, the death certificate said. Completely natural in a woman her age with her health history. A pause. She left everything to a company called Crestline Care Partners. Property savings, life insurance, all of it. Ray said nothing. Slade said nothing. I pulled on Crestline Care Partners, Decker said. LLC registered in the state 3 years earlier. Took me 4 months to get through the registration layers because they were designed to be worked through slowly. At the end of those 4 months, I had a name connected to a mailing address, connected to a tax filing, connected to another LLC. He looked at Ray. The second LLC shared an address with a personal tax filing for a man who worked in financial services in Harlan County. Marcus Webb, Ray said. Marcus Webb, Decker said. The gravel lot was quiet. The rattle of the air conditioner in the office drifted over. Somewhere on the highway, a truck downshifted through its gears. I took it to my supervisor, Decker said. She reviewed it for 3 months and closed the file. Natural causes, she said. The medical examiner had signed off. Crestline Care Partners was a legitimate registered business. The will had been executed properly. He looked at the gravel. I appealed, took it to the state level. 6 weeks later, I was called into an HR meeting about a pattern of unfounded complaints that were creating a hostile working relationship with management. He said this flatly, without self-pity, as a recitation of facts. I was given 2 options. I could modify my approach, or I could resign. He looked up. I didn't modify my approach. Ray looked at him. Decker had been with Iron Ridge for 3 years. He had shown up at the clubhouse on a Tuesday evening with a referral from a man in the club who had known him from before and vouched for his character, and Slade had talked to him for an hour and let him prospect, and he had never made a significant issue of his background or the particular shape of his grievance against the systems that had dismissed him. It wasn't that he'd hidden it, it was that he hadn't led with it because leading with grievance was not how Decker Moss operated. He operated by showing up and doing the work and letting the work make his argument for him. Ray had known the broad strokes. He had not known Ruth Hensley. How many others? Ray said. Decker looked at him steadily. That I know of 6 cases in the county over the past 5 years. Elderly isolated assets transferred before deaths ruled natural. Most of them aren't connected to Webb directly. Some of them I can't connect to anything at all. But the pattern is there if you're looking for it. He paused. Nobody was looking for it. Slade had been listening without speaking. He looked at the storage unit contents spread on the gravel, and then at Decker, and then at Ray. So he's done this before, Slade said. Ruth Hensley is the one I can get closest to, Decker said. The others I can't prove, but yes, this is not a man who made a bad decision under financial pressure. This is a method. He held up the notebook. This woman knows that. That's why she's been building this for 2 years. She knew that her word alone wouldn't be enough. She knew he'd done something like this before and gotten away with it. Or she suspected it because she's a smart woman and she's had 2 years in a locked room to think about the kind of person she's dealing with. Ray reached into his vest pocket and took out Dorothy's $10 bill. He had put it there at the diner and left it there without thinking about it, which was unusual for him because he was not generally a man who kept paper in his vest pocket. He looked at it, then he put it back. We don't go to the police yet, he said. Agreed, Decker said. We need more. We need something he can't explain away. Agreed. Ray looked at Slade. We start with what we can observe, Ray said. Where he goes, what he does, who he talks to. We find the threads. Slade stood up from the gravel. Who's available this week? I'll make calls, Decker said. They packed the documents back into the box in exactly the order they'd come out. Sealed the tape back over the flaps as cleanly as they could manage. Put it back in the center of the unit, centered the way it had been. Ray locked the padlock and stood for a moment with the key in his hand. He put it in his vest pocket next to the $10 bill. Then they drove back toward town, and the highway stretched out ahead of them the way it always did, indifferent to what moved along it, carrying everything without comment. Marcus Allen Webb, it turned out, was a man of regular habits. He was at the First National Bank branch on Cumberland Avenue every Monday morning between 9 and 10:30 in a meeting with a senior loans officer whose name the bank's website listed without particular ceremony. He was at Maple Street Coffee on Tuesday and Thursday mornings between 8 and 9. Sometimes alone with his laptop, sometimes with 1 or 2 clients, he apparently cultivated with the careful sociability of someone who understood that in a small city, reputation was infrastructure. He was at St. Augustine's Church, Dorothy's church, every Sunday morning, where he had joined the finance committee and was, according to the church's newsletter, that Decker found online playing a significant role in organizing the building restoration fund. He volunteered at the food bank on alternating Saturdays. He was a member of the Harlan County Chamber of Commerce. He had been quoted in the local paper twice in the past year, once about small business lending trends and once about community investment, and in both photos, he wore a pressed shirt and looked directly at the camera with the confident ease of someone who had nothing to conceal because he had been very careful about where he concealed things. Ray looked at all of this information spread across the table in the back room of the clubhouse and thought about what Dorothy had said. He's a man who started telling himself a story about what he was doing, and the story got easier to believe the longer he told it. He had spent long enough around people to know what they looked like when they believed their own version of events. It didn't make them less dangerous. Often it made them more dangerous because they didn't carry the self-consciousness of someone who knew they were doing wrong. They moved through the world with the frictionless confidence of the justified. The Iron Ridge approach was not complicated. It was simply presence. No one went to Marcus Webb's house. No one approached him. No one made contact, direct or indirect. What they did was show up in the parking lots and at the tables and in the peripheral vision of a man who had something to hide, and they stayed there visible, impatient, and entirely within the public spaces to which they had as much right as anyone else. The Monday meeting at First National Slade was in the bank parking lot when Marcus arrived, just sitting on his bike, not looking at Marcus, looking at the road. When Marcus walked out an hour later, Slade was still there. The Tuesday morning coffee, Ray was at the corner table when Marcus came in. Ray ordered coffee and read nothing and looked at nothing in particular, which he did every Tuesday morning anyway, but Marcus didn't know that. The Thursday coffee, Decker's truck was in the lot. The Sunday church service, 2 bikes parked in the street. Augustine's lot when the congregation filed out. By Wednesday of the second week, Marcus Webb had started making errors. The first error was small. He mentioned Dorothy to his loans officer during a meeting, mentioned her unprompted. The officer would later tell investigators, brought her up in the context of explaining that he was managing a difficult family situation, that his elderly aunt was declining rapidly, that it was taking a significant toll. The officer had not asked. The meeting was about a commercial lending product. There was no reason to introduce Dorothy into it at all, except that Marcus was beginning to feel the need to manage narratives he had not yet been asked about. The second error was at Maple Street Coffee. He had a client meeting on Thursday morning, and he spent 15 minutes of it explaining that his aunt had been wandering lately, that he was worried that he had spoken to her doctor about the situation, that the family was doing everything they could. The client was a woman who ran an accounting practice, and she later said that she had found the conversation odd because she had not known Marcus had an aunt, and she had not asked, and the level of detail he had provided had felt less like sharing and more like testimony. The third error was at the food bank. He told 2 different volunteers on the same Saturday in conversations that overlapped on the timeline by 30 minutes 2 slightly different versions of why Dorothy wasn't at church anymore. One version had her being too tired for the walk. The other had her doctor recommending reduced social contact for health reasons. The volunteers did not compare notes immediately, but they did eventually. Decker tracked these errors with the patience of a man who had spent years learning how institutions moved and where they leaked. He did not celebrate them. He wrote them down. He dated them. He added them to a file that was beginning to resemble in its careful structure something not unlike the notebook Dorothy had left in Unit 47. What none of them said out loud, but all of them understood, was that pressure produced mistakes only if the person being pressured had something to protect. A man with nothing to hide does not start explaining unprompted. A man with nothing to hide does not produce slightly different versions of the same story in conversations 40 minutes apart. Marcus Webb was protecting something, and he could feel in the way that people with things to hide develop a kind of peripheral radar for it, that he was being watched. He had not yet done anything with that feeling except talk too much. They were waiting for him to do something more. It was Joni Pruitt who moved things forward. Ray came into the Heron on a Friday, which was not his usual day. He needed coffee and he needed to think, and the Heron was where he thought the way some people think, in their cars or their backyards. He sat at the corner table and Joni brought coffee and then stood at the end of the table instead of moving on. He looked up. She had her arms crossed, not in the confrontational way, in the way people cross their arms when they are about to say something they have been working up to. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" She looked at the door, then back at him. "About something I didn't tell you the other day." She paused. "When I said she told me she might not come back." "I remember," he said. Joni reached into the front pocket of her apron and took out her phone. It was an older model, the case cracked along one corner and reinforced with a band of clear packing tape. She held the phone on the table between them without handing it to him. I recorded it, she said. He looked at the phone. She was at the counter, Joni said. It was just the two of us for a few minutes mid-morning, quiet. She leaned in and said what she said, and I don't know why I did it. Instinct, I guess. I've spent 20 years in service jobs learning to read rooms. Something in the way she said it made me. She stopped. I hit record before she finished. How much did you get? Ray said. 47 seconds. Joni looked at the phone. You can hear her clearly. You can hear her say it. She looked up at him. If I don't come back, it's not because I didn't want to. And then she said something I haven't told you. After that, she said, tell someone who looks like they know what standing still means. Ray was very still. She knew, Joni said. Even then, she already knew she was going to come find you, and she was leaving this behind in case she couldn't. He looked at the phone on the table. I know I should have said something sooner, Joni said. I know. But I kept thinking she seems fine. She's clearly getting out. Sometimes maybe it's not as bad as it sounds. Maybe I'm misreading. She looked at her hands. And then I saw the bikes in the lot, and I realized that whatever I was telling myself, you weren't telling yourself the same thing. And maybe that meant I was wrong. Ray reached across the table and picked up the phone. He looked at the lock screen. Can you send this to Decker, he said. Who's Decker? Man who'll know what to do with it legally, Ray said. Who'll know the right person to give it to. Joni nodded. Then she said, is she okay right now? Is she safe? Ray thought about the lock on the outside of the door, the space heater that worked when it felt like it, the food getting smaller 1 degree at a time. He thought about the countdown that was running on a laptop in Marcus Webb's house that no one had seen yet. She will be, he said. Joni took the phone back. She looked at it for a moment longer, the way you look at something you've been carrying and are about to set down, and something in her face changed. I have customers, she said, and she walked away. That night in the back room of the clubhouse on Sawmill Road, Decker listened to the 47 seconds and did not say anything for a time after it ended. The voice on the recording was clear and calm, not frightened, not dramatic. Dorothy Caldwell in the same register she used for everything, explaining a thing she had needed to explain and choosing the audience for it with the precision she brought to everything. If I don't come back, it's not because I didn't want to. Tell someone who looks like they know what standing still means. Decker played it again. Then he looked up at Ray and said, I know who needs to hear this. Her name was Special Agent Donna Hartwell. She worked out of the FBI's Lexington field office. Decker had crossed paths with her 2 years before Iron Ridge, when he was still at the county social services office, and she was working a financial fraud case that overlapped with an elder abuse referral he had submitted. The case had gone nowhere on his end. On her end, it had gone further, and when it closed, she had sent him an email that said in its entirety, your referral mattered. For the record, he had kept that email. He called her the next morning and told her he had something she needed to see. She said, how solid is the storage unit evidence? Decker said, 47 pages solid. She said, get me the documents in the audio file. I'll get you a meeting at the end of the week. Decker said, there's a timeline issue. I don't know how much time we have. A pause on the line. Then Hartwell said, how fast can you move? That was Thursday. By Friday evening, the documents from Unit 47 were with Donna Hartwell's team in Lexington, scanned and logged, and in the hands of a forensic accountant who Hartwell said would have a preliminary financial analysis by Monday. The audio file was with an evidence specialist. Decker's documented history on Crestline Care Partners and Ruth Hensley was being cross-referenced with county records. The warrant application for Marcus Webb's home and devices was being prepared. It would be signed within 48 hours. Ray drove back from Lexington alone. The highway ran north through the dark, the headlight of his bike making a tunnel of light that moved with him and illuminated only what was immediately ahead, which he had always found to be a reasonable metaphor for most things. You saw what you were moving toward. What was behind you was behind you. He got back to Harlan at 9:30 and did not go home. He drove to the clubhouse on Sawmill Road, which was a converted industrial building, with bay doors wide enough for bikes and a back room with a long table and a wood stove that Slade kept burning from October through April. He parked and went inside and said hello to the 3 members who were there and did not explain where he'd been because they would hear about it when there was something to hear. He went to the back room. He sat down at the table. He reached into the inside pocket of his vest, where he kept folded twice a photograph that had been in his possession for 21 years. He set it on the table and looked at it. Tommy Colton, 1998, in the parking lot of a Shoney's in Lexington, squinting into afternoon sun, grinning at the camera, with the particular grin of a man who had not yet developed the relationship with gravity that the following years would produce. He was in his mid-30s in the photo, and he looked like a man who expected to be around for a while. He had died 6 years after this photo was taken, not from violence, not from anything dramatic, from the accumulated small failures of a system that had written him down as managed and then managed him into absence. The call button that took too long, the medication schedule that slipped, the night staff who were 3 people spread across a floor designed for 6, the paperwork that said he was receiving adequate care ticking boxes as evidence of attention he was not actually receiving. Ray had been in Fallujah when the call came. He had been doing something necessary and had been doing it well, and he had been unable to leave. And by the time he could leave, it was too late, and the nurse had said he went quietly, and Ray had understood then and understood now that quietly was not the part that mattered. He looked at the photograph. He thought about a woman in a garage with a lock on the outside of the door, writing 47 pages of notes in a composition notebook, because she understood that no one would believe her without proof and doing it carefully and systematically, and without allowing herself to be consumed by the despair that would have consumed most people, and then handing a key to a stranger in a diner, because she had identified from the back seat of a postal truck someone who knew how to stand still. He thought about what it cost to keep planning for 2 years when the plan required that much faith in the existence of someone worth planning for. He thought about Tommy's laugh, which had been the kind of laugh that made other people laugh involuntarily. Not because the joke was especially good, but because the laugh itself was structurally irresistible. The wood stove ticked in the corner. Outside, Sawmill Road was dark and quiet. He folded the photograph and put it back in his vest. He sat for a while longer without moving, and then he stood up and he banked the wood stove for the night, and he turned off the lamp, and he walked out into the dark and stood for a moment in the lot with the cool air on his face. Slade's truck was parked at the far end. Ray heard the faint sound of the television from the front room, the news probably. Slade watched the news at night the way some men watch the sky, not expecting to be surprised, but feeling obligated to pay attention. Ray walked back to his bike. He needed to sleep. Tomorrow, Hartwell had said she would call him when the warrant was signed, and then the part that Ray and Iron Ridge had been running, the quiet part, the patient part, the part that looked like doing nothing while doing everything, would hand off to the part that had subpoenas and federal jurisdiction and the power to walk through a door that had for too long only had its lock on the outside. He started the engine. The sound of it filled the lot, and then he was moving out onto Sawmill Road heading west, and the night was cold and clear, and full of the particular silence that follows a decision made, and committed to the silence that is not emptiness, but readiness. The silence of a man who has chosen what he is and is moving in that direction without apology or hesitation. He rode home along Highway 421. He knew every mile of it. He had ridden this road in every season, in every weather, in every state of mind that a man passes through in the course of a life that is long enough to contain most of them. He had ridden it grieving, and he had ridden it at peace, and he had ridden it with the specific attentive focus of someone who is waiting for something important to happen and does not intend to be anywhere else when it does. Tonight he wrote it thinking about a notebook. 47 pages, dates and temperatures, meal sizes, the exact words a man had used to make a woman doubt herself. The day the window was sealed, the day the lock went in, every small reduction documented, and at the end of it, a note that said simply, "If I disappear, this is why." 2 years. She had kept that faith for 2 years in a room with no heat and no phone and a door that locked from the outside in the belief that there was someone who would find it and be able to do something with it. He thought about that faith. He thought about what it asked of her and what it was built on. He thought about standing in a parking lot outside a courthouse on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, doing an ordinary thing while an elderly woman in the back seat of a postal truck watched through the window and decided quietly and irrevocably that he was worth the bet. He did not consider himself a man of particular virtue. He had made his share of errors. He had, in the years since Tommy redirected something that had threatened to become bitterness into something more useful, and he had done it imperfectly and with effort and without always knowing if it was working. But he had learned to stand still when it mattered, and apparently that was visible from a moving vehicle from a certain angle on an ordinary Wednesday. The highway unrolled ahead of him. He didn't know it yet, the number that was waiting in a laptop, the arithmetic Hartwell would do twice to make sure of it. He didn't know how close the margin was. He was simply a man riding north through a dark Kentucky night, carrying what he had moving in the right direction. The highway said nothing. It carried him home. The warrant was signed on a Saturday morning at 7:43, which Donna Hartwell noted in her log because she noted everything, including the times of things on the theory that a timeline with no gaps was a timeline that couldn't be argued with. She called Decker at 8. Decker called Ray at 8:04. Ray was already awake. He had been awake since 5:30, which was when he usually woke up, a habit left over from decades of early formation and 2 deployments, and the particular internal clock that develops in men who have spent enough time in places where sleeping past dawn was a choice with consequences. He was sitting at the kitchen table with coffee when the phone rang, and he listened to Decker without speaking, and when Decker was done, he said, "When firing show me down?" Monday. Decker said, "Hartwell wants the weekend to get the forensic team positioned. She goes in Monday morning, 7 a.m. Ray looked out the kitchen window. The yard was early morning gray, the light coming flat, and even the way it came before the sun had fully committed to the day. "Dorothy's in that house until Monday," he said. "I know. Is she safe through the weekend?" Hartwell doesn't think he moves on the weekend. His pattern is weekday mornings when the window of plausible normalcy is widest. Decker paused. "She has eyes on the house, unmarked, and she's moving Dorothy out Friday evening." Ray set his coffee down. "Already, Hartwell made the call this morning. She said she didn't want to wait." Decker's voice was measured. "She's been working Decker's analysis on Ruth Hensley and the escalation pattern in the notebook. She said the last 3 weeks of Dorothy's notes show a change in Marcus's behavior. Shorter visits, less conversation. The kind of pulling back you see when someone is completing a mental separation from what they're about to do." A pause. "Hartwell said she wasn't willing to bet a weekend on a pattern she didn't like." Ray was quiet for a moment. That was the right call. He would have made the same one. "All right," he said. He spent the weekend doing the ordinary things of his ordinary life because there was nothing else to do, and because doing nothing actively was harder than doing something and pretending it was normal. He changed the oil in his bike. He drove to the grocery on Cumberland and bought food he would forget to eat. He sat on the porch in the afternoon and watched the neighborhood conduct itself in the unambitious way neighborhoods conducted themselves on Saturdays in April, and he did not allow himself to calculate hours. He did not always succeed at that last part. Sunday passed the same way, slower. Monday arrived the way significant days sometimes do, without fanfare, identical in its physical presentation to every day preceding it. Gray morning, cool air, the smell of the yard after overnight rain. Ray drove to the Federal Building's satellite office in Harlan and was in the parking lot by 6:15. He sat in his truck and drank gas station coffee and waited. At 7:09, his phone lit up with a text from Decker. One word. In. Ray sat with that word for a moment. Then he started the truck and drove to the Heron Diner because there was nothing for him to do in any federal parking lot, and everything he needed to know would come through Decker and Hartwell and the process that was now running without requiring his presence. He had handed what he had to the people with the authority to do what needed to be done. That was the correct sequence. He sat in the corner booth. Joni brought coffee. He had not told her what was happening today. She had not asked. She had looked at him when he came in, and he had sat down and she had brought the coffee, and there was an understanding between them that had developed over the past 3 weeks that required nothing to be said because everything had already been said in a diner parking lot and a back booth in a 47-second recording. He sat and drank his coffee and looked at the parking lot window. The search of Marcus Webb's home took 4 hours. Hartwell's team went through it room by room with the thorough indifference of people who have learned not to telegraph what they find until they have found everything. The laptop was seized in the first 20 minutes from the home office on the second floor, a neat, carefully arranged room that Hartwell later described to Ray as the most organized room she had entered in a decade of search warrants. Everything in its place. File folders labeled and alphabetized. A color-coded desk calendar with appointments marked in 2 different ink colors whose coding system she did not initially understand and then understood completely when she saw what the appointments were. The garage room was documented in its entirety by a photographer before anything was touched. Hartwell stood in the doorway of that room for a moment before going in. She was not a woman given to pausing in doorways. She paused in this one. A bed narrow with a single blanket that was not sufficient for April in Kentucky and would not have been sufficient for October or November, or the months between which was when Dorothy Caldwell had been sleeping under it. A chair with a torn seat, a space heater plugged into the wall, its dial turned to low. A window with bars on the outside, not decorative, installed with hardware store brackets and lag bolts. a door with a deadbolt on the exterior. The photographer documented all of it. Then Hartwell turned her attention to the laptop. The forensic analyst who worked the device later said he had processed over 300 seized computers in his career and had rarely found one that was, from an evidentiary standpoint, more cooperative. Marcus Webb had not used incognito browsing consistently. He had not cleared his history regularly. He had apparently trusted in the privacy of a locked home office in a way that reflected either supreme confidence or the particular blindness that comes from having gotten away with things before. The search history was extensive and specific. Undetected causes of death in the elderly, hypothermia symptoms versus natural causes, reporting a home death without triggering an investigation. How long does it take for malnutrition to become medically significant? Sedative interactions with cardiac medication in older patients. The analyst flagged each query with its date and time. The queries were not clustered at a single point in time. They were distributed over a period of 8 months, interspersed with ordinary searches for restaurant recommendations and financial news and sports scores, the way a man integrates research into his daily life when the research has become routine. That was what Hartwell would tell Ray later, the detail that stayed with her. Not that the searches existed, but that they were routine, that they sat between a search for parking near a downtown Lexington restaurant and a search for the previous day's stock indices, as though they belonged there. As though the question of how long hypothermia took in an unheated room was simply a thing a man wondered about between lunch reservations and portfolio reviews. The laptop also contained correspondence. Emails and phone records connected Marcus Webb to a physician in Harlan County. The physician's name was Dr. Randall Greer. Hartwell pulled the medical file on Dorothy Caldwell from the county health record system using the warrant scope. She found what she was looking for. A cognitive assessment dated 13 months ago, signed by Dr. Randall Greer. Conclusion: significant cognitive decline consistent with early to moderate stage dementia. Recommendation: supervised living arrangement and legal guardianship. The document was formatted correctly. The letterhead was legitimate. The signature matched the physician's other documents on file. Dorothy Caldwell had not been to Dr. Greer's office for 3 years. The assessment had been conducted per its own documentation at the patient's residence, except that the patient's residence, at the time of the documented assessment, had no record of Dr. Greer's vehicle in the security camera footage from the neighbor's driveway camera, which covered a partial view of Marcus Webb's street and which the neighbor had provided willingly when a federal agent knocked on his door Monday afternoon and explained in general terms what was needed. No vehicle, no visit, no assessment, a document that said otherwise signed by a man who had not been there. But that was not the only camera footage Hartwell's team recovered that day. The manager of Pine Ridge Self-Storage, presented with a warrant for facility records and security footage, produced 11 months of recordings without delay. The analyst who reviewed the footage found what he was looking for within 2 hours. Dorothy Caldwell appeared on camera 11 times over a period of 2 years, always during weekday business hours, always arriving in the same postal vehicle. On the first several visits, she moved between her unit and the office counter, organizing the box, adding documents. The visits became shorter as time went on, the box presumably complete. On the final visit, 3 weeks before Ray Colton received a key in a diner, Dorothy could be seen standing at the facility office counter for 6 minutes after her unit visit was complete. The counter held a pen and a small display of shipping supplies. She was not purchasing anything. She was practicing. The analyst described it in his report as a rehearsed motion, precise, and repeated her right hand moving from her purse to the countertop and back in a gesture that anyone watching casually would have taken for someone checking her bag. On the fourth repetition, a small object transferred from her hand to the counter surface and back again. She had been rehearsing the pass. She had known even then exactly how she intended to give the key to whoever she chose to give it to, and she had practiced until the motion was natural enough to survive the anxiety of the moment and the presence of other people in the pressure of a 2-hour window she could not afford to misuse. Ray read that section of Hartwell's report twice. He read it the way you read something that confirms a thing you already knew, but had not been able to fully articulate, the way confirmation sometimes carries more weight than discovery, because it transforms a belief into a fact and a fact into something you can stand on. She had planned all of it, every detail. She had trusted him with a plan she had built over 2 years in a locked room, and she had practiced the handoff, and she had walked into a diner and sat down across from a stranger, and it had worked. Hartwell drove to Dr. Randall Greer's office at 4:15 on Monday afternoon. He was seeing his last patient of the day. She waited in the parking lot. When the patient left and the front office staff were gathering their things, she went in, badged herself to the receptionist, and asked to see the doctor alone. Greer was 61 with the look of a man who had been reasonably healthy and was now going through a period of poor sleep. He had gray at his temples and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the slightly distracted air of someone whose mind was operating on a different track from the one his face was presenting to the world. When Hartwell came in and sat down across from him, his face did not change immediately. Then she placed a copy of the cognitive assessment on the desk between them, and he looked at it. His face changed. It did not change into the face of a guilty man asserting his innocence. It changed into the face of a man who has been waiting with a considerable dread for a specific knock at a specific door, and who experiences the arrival of that knock less as shock than as a grim confirmation that the wait is finally over. He did not speak for a long time. Hartwell let the silence sit. "How bad is it?" Greer said. "That depends on what you do in the next 24 hours, Hartwell said. He looked at the assessment again. Then he took his reading glasses down from his forehead and set them on the desk and rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands in the way of a man performing a kind of internal accounting. "I need you to understand something," he said, and Hartwell said she was listening. He had known Marcus Webb for 20 years. They had been neighbors briefly when Webb was a young man, and Greer's practice was new, and his finances were the finances of a new practice, which is to say precarious, in the specific way that good intentions without capital tend to be precarious. In 2019, his practice had come close to failing. Equipment loan staffing cost the gap between what insurance reimbursed and what care actually cost. He had been 4 months from closing when Marcus Webb had appeared at his door with a proposal. Not a bank loan, a personal arrangement, informal, off the books, the kind of arrangement that is in retrospect the purchase of something the buyer has not yet named, but has every intention of collecting. Webb had collected 13 months ago, standing in this same office, placing a folder of financial documents on the same desk, and asking Greer to sign a form that would establish Dorothy Caldwell's cognitive incapacity. Greer said he had refused twice. The third time, Marcus Webb placed alongside the financial documents a separate folder containing a copy of the informal loan arrangement annotated with language that Greer's attorney would later describe as deliberately structured to imply fraudulent intent on Greer's part. He had signed. He told Hartwell this in the flat, careful voice of a man who has stopped trying to make something sound better than it is and is simply accounting for it accurately the way you account for damage in an insurance report. What happened, when it happened, what he did not do, what it quantum. When he was finished, Hartwell looked at him for a moment. "Dorothy Caldwell is alive," she said. "She's safe for now." Greer closed his eyes briefly. "In the next 24 hours, Hartwell said, you can provide a full written statement, including all communication with Marcus Webb, the circumstances of the document, and any other individuals or cases you're aware of that may be relevant." She paused. "Or you can call an attorney tonight and spend the next several years explaining to a jury why a 72-year-old woman who was in your care on paper was living in an unheated garage with bars on the window." Greer opened his eyes. "I'll give you the statement," he said. He did not ask about his license. He already knew. There are things a person knows before they are told because they have been living in proximity to the consequence long enough to understand its shape. The statement Greer provided that evening ran to 19 pages. It included details that opened 3 additional lines of investigation and confirmed what Decker had suspected about Ruth Hensley, though confirming it and proving it in a court of law were different things and would remain different things for some time. It also included the name of the notary public who had witnessed the property deed transfer, who had witnessed Dorothy's supposedly voluntary signature, a part-time legal assistant who, when contacted by Hartwell's office, agreed to a voluntary interview with considerable speed and an attorney present. The case was expanding in the way that cases expand when they have been carefully built and when the first structural piece is removed and the architecture becomes visible. The forensic analyst working through Tuesday night came to the file. It was a Word document stored in a subfolder within a folder labeled Administrative, which was itself within a folder labeled Personal, which suggested either careful concealment or the organizational logic of a man so confident in his privacy that he filed things under their actual names. The file was called EC_arrangements_final. The document was what Hartwell had expected it to be. Specific, detailed, arranged with the thoroughness of someone who had thought through every logistical contingency of an event he was treating as a planning problem rather than a crime. Service provider contacts, preferred timeline, notes on managing the sequence of notifications to avoid overlap, A draft statement for the relevant authorities that explained in measured and sorrowful language the long decline of a beloved family member. The metadata told its own story. Date of creation 18 months ago, 14 subsequent revisions, the last of which had been made 9 days before Hartwell's warrant was executed. The revision history showed the document evolving from a rough outline into something precise and scheduled the way a plan evolves when it is being refined toward execution. The scheduled date. Hartwell did the arithmetic twice because arithmetic done once can contain errors and arithmetic done twice can be stood behind. She had moved Dorothy to the safe house on a Friday. The date in the document was 11 days before that Friday. She had moved Dorothy with 4 days to spare. She sat with that number for a long moment. Then she printed the document in the metadata record and drove to Harlan and met Ray at a corner table in the Heron Diner, which was closed by then, but which Joni had opened for them without being asked, leaving a pot of coffee on the burner and locking the front door from the inside with a key she handed to Hartwell. Hartwell sat across from Ray and placed the printout in front of him. Ray looked at the document, then he looked at the metadata. Then he did the arithmetic himself, which produced the same number. 11. He sat with it. Hartwell said nothing. She gave him the time. He looked at the scheduled date. He thought about Dorothy walking into the Heron Diner on a Tuesday in April, the coat buttoned to the collar, the careful, deliberate limp, the eyes moving around the room before the rest of her followed. The way she had looked at him when he pulled out the chair, not with relief, but with the focused, specific attention of someone completing a calculation they had been running for a long time. If she had waited another week, if Beth Carver had not had a delivery that Tuesday, if the morning had run differently by any of a dozen variables, any of which could have run differently, any of which was not guaranteed to have gone the way it went. 11 days. The booking record for the cremation service in Middlesbrough was recovered separately through a subpoena served to the funeral home on Wednesday. The deposit had been made in cash. The request form noted the services required no viewing direct cremation minimum lead time. The staff member, who had taken the booking later, told investigators that she had found the caller organized and efficient and had noted nothing unusual at the time because organized and efficient were qualities she associated with people who were being responsible about an anticipated loss. Marcus Webb had booked the service in advance of any loss occurring. He had deposited money against a death that had not yet happened and that he had scheduled to happen at a time of his choosing. The arrest took place on a Wednesday morning. Marcus Webb came out of his front door at 7:23, dressed in a pressed shirt and dark trousers, carrying a leather portfolio, walking toward his car with the unhurried purposefulness of a man who has somewhere to be and is not concerned about being there on time because being on time is a habit so embedded it has stopped requiring attention. 2 agents met him at the end of his driveway. He asked for his attorney before he asked anything else. Hartwell had expected that. It was in its way the most organized thing he did all morning. He was transported to the federal building in Lexington, and the processing took the time it took, and his attorney arrived within 2 hours, which indicated that the attorney had been identified in advance and was either on retainer or had been briefed previously on the possibility of this scenario, which was itself a data point. Dorothy was not in the house when the agents went in for the second time. She had been moved the previous Friday evening, 3 days before the warrant, to a safe house in the next county. The decision had not required the metadata to be made. Hartwell had made it based on Decker's pattern analysis of Ruth Hensley's case and the behavioral shift Dorothy had documented in the final weeks of her notebook, the pulling back the shorter visits, the growing silence of a man preparing himself for what came next. The metadata, when it arrived, had confirmed what Hartwell had already acted on. Dorothy had gone with a female agent and a county social worker without incident. When the social worker explained what was happening, Dorothy had said, "I know." She had then asked for her coat, which was the navy toggle button coat she had worn to the Heron Diner, and she had put it on and walked out with the measured, careful step of a woman who had been waiting for this particular door to open for 2 years. She had not looked back at the garage room. The safe house had a heater that worked, and windows with no bars, and a lock on the inside of every door, and a kitchen where food arrived in normal quantities at normal intervals. And Dorothy Caldwell sat at the kitchen table on the first morning and ate breakfast with the specific, unhurried attention of a woman relearning what it felt like to be allowed. When the investigator from Hartwell's team came to take her statement, Dorothy asked for a legal pad and a pen. The investigator provided them, uncertain why. Dorothy used the pad to take her own notes during the interview. Not because she mistrusted the process, because she was a woman who had spent decades in professional life where you wrote things down as they happened, and habits formed over 40 years are not broken by extraordinary circumstances, only temporarily suspended. She testified for 4 hours. She spoke in the same voice she had used with Ray in the diner. Not raised, not broken, not performing. The voice of a person who has had very clear thoughts for a very long time and is now in the presence of someone with the authority to do something with them. The investigator later said it was the most organized verbal account she had ever received from a witness, and that she had interviewed witnesses in a significant number of serious federal cases over 15 years of work. Dorothy corroborated everything the documents contained and added details that the documents did not. The exact phrases Marcus had used on specific occasions to make her doubt her own perception. The names of friends who had stopped coming and what they had been told. The day she had heard Marcus on the phone through the thin wall of the garage room, using language she now understood as planning language, scheduling language, the language of logistics rather than care. When the investigator asked why she had not sought help sooner, Dorothy set down her pen. Because I understood exactly what he had built, she said. He had a signed medical document saying I was incompetent. He had explanations for everything that were specific and plausible, and delivered by a man who wore pressed shirts and sat on the church finance committee. And I was an old woman who lived in a converted garage and hadn't been seen in public in months. She looked at the investigator. If I had called the police in the first year, he would have answered the door in that pressed shirt and told them I was confused, and they would have believed him, and I would have lost the only thing I still had, which was the element of surprise. She picked up the pen. So I waited, she said, and I prepared, and I found someone who I believed would know what to do with what I had prepared. Ray Colton, the investigator said. Ray Colton, Dorothy confirmed. She made a note on her legal pad, then she looked up. He pulled out the chair, she said, when everyone else was saving their seat for someone who wasn't coming. The Harlan County community encountered the news the way small communities encounter news about people they know, which is with a mixture of shock and a particular secondary unease that arrives slightly later and is harder to name. The shock was about Marcus. The secondary unease was about themselves. The neighbors who had accepted his explanations. The church committee members who had worked alongside him for 2 years without asking why Dorothy had stopped attending. The bank officer who had processed pension deposits redirected into an account Dorothy had no access to and who had not thought to verify. The quilting circle friends who had called twice received plausible explanations and stopped calling. None of them were charged with anything. The law is specific about what constitutes criminal neglect and what constitutes the ordinary human tendency to accept the explanations of people who seem credible and to avoid the discomfort of situations that are not clearly your business. But they sat in the courtroom. That was the thing. They sat in the Harlan County federal courtroom for the proceedings that followed, and they listened to the evidence laid out in the flat, organized language of federal prosecution, and they heard the audio file 47 seconds of Dorothy's voice saying, if I don't come back, it's not because I didn't want to. And they heard the metadata on the cremation booking, and they heard the search history read into the record query by query, and they sat with all of it in a room they could not leave without passing each other in the hall, and that was a form of reckoning that no indictment could produce and no sentence could replace. The defense tried 2 approaches, and neither of them held. The first was caregiver stress. The argument that Marcus Webb had been overwhelmed by the demands of caring for a declining relative, that his judgment had been compromised by exhaustion and financial pressure, that the appropriate response was compassion and treatment rather than prosecution. The argument might have been more persuasive if the defendant had at any point in his period of supposed caregiving sought or accepted any form of assistance, any respite care, any medical consultation that was not designed to generate documentation useful to his plan. He had not. The second was cognitive incapacity. The defense attempted to use Dr. Greer's signed assessment as evidence that Marcus had genuinely believed Dorothy was impaired and had acted accordingly. Dr. Greer, testifying for the prosecution under the terms of his cooperation agreement, explained in precise and detailed language exactly how the assessment had been generated and the conditions under which he had signed it. He did not look at Marcus Webb during this testimony. Marcus Webb looked at Greer throughout it. When the prosecution played the voicemail, the courtroom became very still. It had been found in the deleted folder of Marcus Webb's phone recovered by the forensic team. 42 seconds left on the answering service of an insurance processing representative. Marcus Webb's voice measured and professional, asking about timelines for processing a death benefit claim following a home death, asking specifically whether cremation prior to claim submission created any administrative complications, asking how soon a check could be issued once the death certificate was filed. The voicemail was dated 6 weeks before the warrant was executed, 6 weeks before Dorothy Caldwell was safe. The prosecution played it once. They did not play it twice. They did not need to. The jury received the case on a Thursday afternoon. They deliberated for a day and a half. The verdict was returned on a Friday at 11:20 in the morning. Guilty on all counts: financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, unlawful imprisonment, criminal neglect causing bodily harm, conspiracy to commit fraud. The conspiracy count extended to Dr. Greer, who was addressed in a separate proceeding and who had accepted in exchange for his cooperation a plea arrangement that involved the permanent surrender of his medical license, supervised probation, and a civil judgment in favor of Dorothy Caldwell for an amount that her attorney described as appropriate. Marcus Webb received his sentence 4 months later. He stood at the defendant's table in the same pressed shirt he had worn on the day of his arrest, and he heard the number the judge read into the record, and his face did not change very much, which was possibly the most honest thing about him. Dorothy was in the courtroom when the verdict was read. She was seated in the third row from the back between Ray Colton on her left and Slade Harmon on her right. She was wearing a blue cardigan, and her hair had grown out slightly from the practical cut it had been given without her input, and was beginning to find its way back toward the shape it would have chosen for itself. When the jury foreperson said guilty, Dorothy did not react visibly. She did not cry or exhale or grip anyone's arm. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the front of the courtroom for a moment. Then she nodded. Once slowly, with the finality of a woman closing a book she has read to its last word and setting it down and knowing she will not open it again. Ray did not look at the front of the courtroom. He looked at Dorothy. And what he saw in her face in that moment was not triumph and was not relief exactly, though it was adjacent to relief. It was the expression of a person returning to themselves after a long absence. Coming back to a room they had not been allowed to be in, finding it more or less as they had left it, understanding that the process of settling back into it would take time, but that the door was open and the lock was on the right side, and the next step was simply to take it. He thought about Tommy. He thought about Tommy every time something like this reached its proper end, not from habit, but from something that served the same function as gratitude. The way a man who has been given a second opportunity to do a thing correctly thinks of the first attempt, not with guilt, but with the acknowledgement that it counts, that it happened, that it is part of why he does the thing the way he does it now. He looked at the front of the courtroom. Then he looked at Dorothy again. She turned her head and met his eyes. She said nothing. He said nothing. They sat in the federal courtroom on a Friday in November, while the business of the court continued around them, and the second hand on the wall clock moved without hesitating. And outside the windows, the November light came flat and even over a city that would return to its ordinary operations in the way that cities do, absorbing the exceptional back into the everyday, and the moment between them was not long and was not dramatic and contained more than most moments that are both. Then Dorothy looked toward the front of the courtroom, and Ray looked at his hands, and the moment became the next moment, and they stood when they were supposed to stand, and filed out when the proceeding concluded, and walked into the hall where the fluorescent lights hummed and the marble floors carried footsteps at a volume that seemed designed to remind everyone present that they were somewhere that took things seriously. Joni Pruitt was in the hall. She had driven from Harlan that morning and sat in the overflow seating and had not told Ray she was coming, not because she was secretive, but because she had not decided to come until 6:30 that morning and had not seen a reason to announce it. She was still in her work clothes, or clothes that looked enough like her work clothes that the distinction probably didn't matter to her. She looked at Dorothy. Dorothy looked at her. "She's the one," Ray said to Dorothy, "who kept the recording." Dorothy looked at Joni for a moment. Then she stepped forward and took Joni's hand in both of her own and held it for a moment without speaking. And Joni looked at the ceiling briefly in the way people look at ceilings when they are managing something, and then Dorothy released her hand and stepped back. "Thank you for not throwing it away," Dorothy said. "I almost did," Joni said. "I know," Dorothy said. "Thank you anyway." Maple Creek Care Center sat on the west side of Harlan, a facility that had been renovated twice in the past decade and managed by a director who had entered the profession for reasons she still remembered and had not yet found a reason to revise. It was not a large facility. It was not a facility that appeared in any ratings publication or received particular external attention. What it had was a staff-to-resident ratio that allowed for attention, a protocol for responding to call buttons that was measured in minutes rather than hours, and the administrative policy that every resident's door locked from the inside. Dorothy Caldwell moved in on a Tuesday in December. Her room faced the facility's rear garden, which in December was dormant, but offered even dormant the sense of a space that had the intention of being alive again. She chose the bed position that put the window at her left side rather than her feet, which was not the default arrangement, and the staff member, helping her move in, rearranged the room without comment. There was a phone on the nightstand. Dorothy picked it up the first afternoon and held it for a moment in a way that had nothing to do with making a call. Then she set it down and looked at it, and it was hers, and no one would disconnect it, and she could use it or not use it, and either was entirely her decision. She lay down on the bed that first afternoon in the room with the window facing the garden, and the door with the interior lock, and the heater that worked, and she slept for 3 hours in the middle of the day, which she had not done voluntarily in 2 years. And when she woke up, the light through the window had shifted to the particular amber of a December late afternoon, and she lay there and looked at the light for a while before getting up. She found a set of watercolors in the activities room a week later. Cheap ones, the kind in a plastic tray with a small brush and a pad of acceptable paper. Nothing like the sets she had owned years ago, and which had, along with most of her possessions, been absorbed into Marcus's management of her affairs. She took the set to her room and did not use it immediately. She sat it on the windowsill and looked at it for 2 days, the way you look at something you're not sure you still know how to want. On the third day, she opened the tray and wet the brush and touched it to the cadmium yellow block and drew a line across the paper. It was not a good line. Her hand was not what it had been. But it was a line, and it was yellow, and it was hers. She worked slowly at first. An hour here, 40 minutes there. Landscapes mostly, which she had always preferred, because landscapes did not require you to get anyone's expression right, only the quality of the light and the depth of the distance. And she had across her life spent enough time looking at the particular geography of Harlan County to know how to render its character in watercolor. She painted the rear garden of Maple Creek in February, the bare-limbed dogwoods holding their potential in the gray air. She painted the view from the Heron Diner's corner booth, what you saw when you looked out the window toward the parking lot. She painted small, 8 inches by 10 mostly, portable. On the second Tuesday in January, Ray Colton came to Maple Creek at noon and drove her to the Heron Diner. He had called ahead, which was something he did not generally do to ensure the corner booth was available. Joni had set a reserved card on the table and then felt slightly embarrassed about the card and removed it and put it back and finally left it because it was accurate. Dorothy got out of the truck with the help of her cane, a new one, that the facility had fitted properly for her height, and walked into the diner without looking over her shoulder, which Ray noticed and did not remark on. They sat in the corner booth. Joni brought coffee without being asked. Dorothy ordered coffee and toast, which was what she had ordered the first time, and Ray did not think about that until the toast arrived, and Dorothy picked up a piece and ate it without measuring her bites, without the mechanical caution of someone going through the motions of eating, just ate it the way a person eats something they are enjoying. And he thought about it then. They talked some. About the garden at Maple Creek, which was going to be planted in March and which Dorothy had been invited to contribute to if she wanted. About the activities director, who was younger than Dorothy had expected and more competent than she had feared. About the Tuesday morning light through the diner window, which Dorothy said was different from the Tuesday morning light through any other window she could recall. Ray asked how she was sleeping. She said well, which he believed. He asked if she needed anything. She said she did not think so. They sat in a comfortable silence that was different from the silence of their first meeting. The first silence had been careful assessed, weighted with everything unsaid between strangers who had sized each other up and were not yet sure what they had found. This one was the silence of people who have been through something together and have reached the part of it where silence is simply how two people can be in the same space without needing to fill it. When they were leaving, Dorothy reached into her coat pocket and took out a small painting, rolled gently and secured with a rubber band. She handed it to Ray. He unrolled it carefully. 8 inches by 10 watercolor on paper. Highway 421 going north. Early morning before the traffic had claimed it. The composition was simple. The road centered the horizon low, the sky taking up most of the space. He looked at it for a long time. The light in the painting was warmer than Highway 421 at that hour had any right to be. He looked at it and decided that was accurate anyway, that some things deserve to be rendered in better light than they actually received. "It's yours," she said. "I know where I'm putting it," he said. She looked at him. He folded the painting carefully in the way he folded things he was planning to keep. The clubhouse on Sawmill Road had, over the years, accumulated a particular collection of wall-mounted items that reflected less a decorating philosophy then the organic accumulation of things that mattered to the people who spent time there. State chapter patches from clubs that had folded. A mounted license plate from a bike that had been totaled and the rider had survived. A photograph of the founding members from a year that preceded Ray's membership, by a decade the image slightly overexposed so that everyone in it looked lit from within. And now on the east wall of the back room beside the wood stove, a small watercolor painting in a simple frame that Ray had bought at the hardware store and assembled himself over a Sunday afternoon. Highway 421 going north. Beside it, not framed, tacked directly to the wall with a single pushpin in the upper left corner, a photograph. A man in his mid-30s, squinting into afternoon sun in a parking lot, grinning with the unguarded ease of someone who expects more time. Tommy Colton, 1998. Lexington. No label, no caption, no explanation offered to anyone who asked, which was fine because the people who asked were the people who would understand if he chose to say something, and the people who didn't ask were the people who could read a wall and understand that some things put side by side need nothing written between them. The second Tuesday, Dorothy brought another painting, a different scene. The rear garden at Maple Creek, the dogwoods. Ray hung it to the left of the first. By April, there were 6, the corner booth at the Heron, the view through the window that faced the parking lot, the Maple Creek garden in March when the first growth came back, a road at dusk that might have been 421 or might have been any road the specifics yielded to the light. A single window interior, unshone sunlight coming through from outside, the kind of light that means morning and means open and means another day, beginning on its own terms. Ray hung them all on the east wall where the light was good, where the wood stove was where people sat in the evenings when the weather was cold, which in Kentucky was a significant portion of the year. So the people who spent time at the clubhouse on Sawmill Road spent time in proximity to those paintings, and most of them knew the general shape of the story behind them without having been told the details. And none of them had asked Ray to explain the photograph of the man squinting in the parking lot, though some of them had been around long enough to know the photograph had been there before the paintings arrived and had been the only thing on that wall for a long time. On a Tuesday in late March, when the temperature had finally committed to something above 50 and the highway had that quality of new season light that makes distances look achievable, Ray sat in the corner booth at the Heron Diner and looked at his coffee. Joni had not yet refilled it. She was at the counter, her back to him, writing an order. The door opened. He looked up. Dorothy Caldwell came in. She was wearing a lighter coat than she'd worn in winter gray, this time open at the front, no need to button it. She was using the cane, but the way she moved with it had changed from the first time he had seen her. It was not the instrument of compensation it had been that April day when she had limped through a crowded room counting the minutes she had left. It was simply part of how she moved, now incorporated, owned, unremarkable. She was not checking the parking lot window. She was looking for him, and she found him, and she came directly to the booth, and Ray reached across and pulled out the chair, and she sat down. Joni came over with 2 cups without being asked. "How's the garden?" Ray said. "The tulips came up," Dorothy said. "Later than I thought, but they came." She put her coat on the seat beside her, open and unguarded and not buttoned to any collar, and her hands came to rest on the table, and she was there, present and intact and entirely herself, which was a thing she had worked to preserve in a locked room for 2 years, and which now, on the other side of what that had cost her, had the quality of something earned and kept, and not easily taken away again. They sat in the Tuesday morning light. The diner conducted its ordinary business around them. The couple by the window, different people now from the ones who had been there that first day, sat with their coffee and their unhurried breakfast. Joni moved between tables with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this long enough to do it without effort. Outside Highway 421 carried the morning traffic in both directions, the way it always had, the way it would continue to do, long after everyone in this room was gone. Ray looked out the window. He thought about something Dorothy had said in the diner that first day, the day before he knew her name or her story, or the 2 years she had spent preparing for a moment that might not come. She had said things don't always survive being bypassed. He thought about the particular thing that had not been bypassed, the thing that had been so easy to walk past, so easy to offer a polite smile and a mumbled excuse and an averted gaze. An old woman in a winter coat in a warm room, standing at the edge of tables where there was always somehow a seat being saved for someone who would never arrive. He thought about what it had cost her to walk across that room one more time, to the last table, to the last possibility, carrying 2 years of evidence and a practiced sleight of hand and the faith of someone who has done everything they can do alone and is now asking the only question they have left. He thought about how easy it would have been to say no, to look at the empty booth across from him and say something apologetic, something about expecting someone, something that would let them both move on without complication, without the weight of what was coming, without the 23 days of pressure and patience and federal warrants, and a woman in a garage with a composition notebook who had written 47 pages of proof that she was not confused. He had said yes, not out of heroism, not because he had assessed the situation and made a calculation. He had said yes because the woman had asked to sit down and the chair was empty, and saying no had never been something he had much patience for in himself. The rest had followed from that. A key in his vest pocket, a storage unit, a man named Decker who had spent 4 years waiting for someone to find the same thread he had found, a woman named Joni who had recorded 47 seconds and kept the file and found the courage to produce it when courage was what the moment required, an agent who had driven to a doctor's office and asked a question and sat in the silence until the answer came, all of it from a chair pulled out in a corner booth on a Tuesday morning. He looked at Dorothy. She was looking at the window watching the highway, and whatever she was thinking, she kept it to herself for the moment, which was her right, which was one of many rights she had again, and Ray did not feel the need to fill the space. They sat there together in the ordinary April morning in the diner that had been there since 1987 and had managed to survive being bypassed and was still here, still pouring coffee, still carrying the weight of the small and significant exchanges that happen in places like this, in rooms where ordinary people sit down with each other. And occasionally, if the conditions are right, if the attention is paid, if the chair is pulled out, find out what the other one is made of. Dorothy picked up her coffee. Ray picked up his. Outside, the highway hummed, and in the police station in Harlan County, in a room with fluorescent lights and a clock with a second hand that lurched instead of swept, the question had already been asked and already been answered. How did you know she asked to sit down? That was the answer. And also not quite the answer, because the asking was only half of it. The asking was what Dorothy had done. It had cost her 2 years in a lock-in room and a faith that would have broken most people before they got halfway through it. The other half was what Ray had done, and the other half was the yes.